Hello friends, this is tutorial number 80 in this C++ programming language course. In this tutorial we will talk about exception handling, and let's create one application. We will create two integer variables x and y, and we can create also variable z, which will be float, and we will initialize variable x with 6, for example. Y will be 0, and we will also define z will be, this is float variable, it will be division of variable x and y, and we want to print variable z. We will see what will happen. Okay, let's build and run this. As you can see, z equals to infinity. Why is that? Of course, we divided with 0, and this is what we should not do. As you already know, we can't divide with 0, but sometimes this kind of errors it can happen. And how we can prevent this to happen, or at least we can write some message to tell us where the problem is. We need to use a try and catch block. Okay, we can use try block here, and of course inside we will write what we want to do. We want to define a variable z. Z will be equal float x divided with y. And in the case we can create if statement. For example, if we have this situation, y equals to 0 and we cannot divide with 0, we can write some if statement. If y equals to 0, we can throw an exception. We can throw whatever we want, but in this case z is a float, we can throw some float value. We will throw 1.0, for example, and we need to type f because it's a float variable. Now we need a catch block. This catch block will run if exception is caught, but we threw a float here, and also if we want, we can define z as that exception. But okay, first let's define catch block. Inside this bracket we need to write what will be caught. We will write a float, and we will give some value f. And inside the catch block we can write some message. We will write division by 0. And this catch block will run if float exception is caught and we throw a float. And this means if y is 0, this exception will be trued and catch block will caught it. Okay, division by 0, and okay, we can try to see how it will work. Okay, as you can see, we have exception message division by 0, but that is still infinity because we have tried to define z, but exception is caught, and we get this message instead. And of course, z is still infinity because we couldn't define z. Because we have true float exception here. Variable z is float. If we want, we can define z with this. Just a second, not here. Here, if we want, we can define z as a float, because float exception will be caught. This is 1.0. If we build and run, and we can also, before we run, we can write a message. Default value will be added. It's some simple message. Now, if we run this program, z should be equal to 1. Okay, as you can see, division by 0, default value will be added, and z equals to 1. What we wanted to do, we have defined z as a division of variable x and y. But in case that y equals to 0, we can't divide with 0, we throw an exception, which is this float value. We could throw 1, 2, 3, it's a float, 4.7, 5.6, whatever value we could throw. And this catch block will this is for float exception. If float exception is caught, this message will run. And we because of float exception, we defined that with this float exception, which is caught. Okay, now we also, if we want, we can throw char. We can catch char exception. Sorry. I will define it with ch, but in this case will not run, because it will not run because we can't define z, which is float. We cannot define with char, and this means that these two, this comment and this defining with char, we cannot initialize float with a char. And we can try to see what will happen, but as you can see, we have an error. This was crashed. Why this was crashed? Because we threw a float exception, and we have a catch block with char, and no char was caught. And this means we need to have, I will return here float, but I don't need to return, I will left it char, and here instead of char we will throw some char exception A, and we will have the same message. As you can see, division by 0. And of course we couldn't define that it's still infinity, but we threw a char exception, and it was caught here in the catch block, because we define this catch block with char. But also we can have more catch blocks if we want. For example, we can have a boolean we will define with b, we will have the same message, division by 0. And we will write some extra message. Boolean catch. And here we will write char catch. Okay, and what this means, this catch block will run if char exception is caught, and this another catch block will run in the case if but I forgot the line here. This catch block will run if boolean exception is caught. Now if we run this, char exception will run, as you can see, char catch. But instead of char exception, we can throw false. And if we run, as you can see, it's boolean catch now. Because why is that? Because we caught a boolean exception, which is here, as you can see, and this message has run. Of course, we can use another data type. We can also use a double. We can use a float, integer, of course. And we can also create, but maybe if we want to have so many catch blocks, we need, for example, 2 or 3. We can also have default catch block. Let's define it, and this is ellipsis with 3 dots. This means this will run if any data type is caught. For example, this is char. If the char exception is caught, this catch block will run. If we throw exception boolean, this catch block will run. And if it is float, double, string, another data type, this default catch block will run. Let me define this. We will write a message. Default catch. And of course, again, we will have a message, division by 0. I will just copy and paste. And I will change here. We will throw number 1, which will be an integer, and by default it's not a char, it's not a boolean, it's another data type, and now default catch should run. We will see if it will run properly. As you can see, division by 0 and default catch. It is because we caught exception with another data type, but we will need float here instead of boolean. I will define float exception because we have variable float, and instead of boolean I will change to float catch, and I will define z with this caught float. And if I type 1.7, now what it will be default catch. It's not because it's not it's a float, but we cannot if we type only 1.7 and if we don't type f, this will be a double. If we want to define double, we can type if we want we can type d, but it's not necessary. But when we have a float, we need to type f. And this catch default catch block is pretty much important, because if we don't have this default catch block, for example, if we define only a char catch block and we don't have a char, our program will crash. And this default catch block is pretty much important. And let me just now try to build and run this. As you can see, division, but a bit it need to be by. It's my mistake. And also we can write a message default, but I also had defined it here, but here I will delete and I will write here the message again. Default value will be added. Now I will build and run. As you can see, division by 0, float catch, default value will be added at z equals to 1.7, which is good. But what I want to do now, I want to do the same thing, but I want to use a function. We need to create one float function. It will be float division, and we will need two parameters. It will be integer a and integer b. And inside we will define one float value c. And let's try to define C. We will need try block, and C will be equals to float of A divided with B. And we also need the if statement. If b equals to 0, we will throw exception. For example, in this case, we will throw, let's throw some some char. And now we will need a catch block. I will use the catch block, will be completely the same. Okay, I have a catch block for the char, for the float and default. We have 3 catch blocks, and in the end this is a float function. At the end of the function we will, just a second, we will return a local variable c. And here now, just a second, I can delete this try catch block from the main function. We will use this division function that we already made. We have throw exception, which is char, and now let's call this function. This is a float function. We can define z with this division function, and we will use variables x and y. And okay, I have right here z equals to f. Z is global variable. Here we have a variable c, which is local variable. Now let's build and run again. Okay, as you can see, division by 0, char catch, and z equals to infinity. Because we have thrown exception char, and this char catch block has run. And of course, but we will also try another catch blocks, but I forgot to tell you, this will run only in case that we are dividing with 0. If we dividing with 2, this application will run completely normal. Okay, as you can see, z equals to 3, or we can type 4. As you can see, z equals to 1.5. If we don't have some exception, for example, application will run normally. And now let's put y to 0 to try another. Now we can throw something is wrong, which is string. If we build and run now, as you can see, it's a string and it's a default catch. And also we have catch for char, for the float, and if it's another data type, the default catch block will run. And of course we can use a double, 0.5, which is a double, and again default catch will run, and z will be infinity because it's not defined. We couldn't define. And only in the case if we have float exception, we will type 0.5f. Float exception will be thrown and will be called also. In the case of float exception, we will define this local variable, float variable, with this float exception, and it will be returned, and z should be defined with this exception 0.5f. Now we will see if it will run normally. As you can see, division by 0, we have a float catch, default value will be added, and z equals to 0.5. Of course we could type 3.7, it doesn't matter. We can throw exception, we can throw what we want to throw, it doesn't matter, but we only need to define catch block properly. If we are throw our variable, we try to define a variable which is float, and we can define we can add some default value if thrown exception is float. Okay, and I really hope that you understand it. If you like this tutorial, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on Twitter, and you can follow me on Instagram only. You have a link in the description, and I will see you in the next tutorial.